Hey, everybody. Let me ask you a question. What is the state of your relationships in all areas of your life? I mean, do you feel like connecting is a lost art, or at least one that you've lost your muscle memory on? If so, I promise you're in the right place. And we're going to talk about how to build more meaningful business relationships and any kind of relationships, really, in just a moment. But first, welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. You can get, if you're watching us live, you can get all future live episodes by being where you are right now. But if you're listening to or watching us later on the podcast, you can get in on this earlier by interact with us by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. You can just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn so that you can get into the action sooner. Now, if you're with us live, I hope that you'll imagine, maybe you won't have to imagine, that you're joining us for a cup of coffee. Just share your questions, your comments, and your ideas. All of them will make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast. And of course, it also means that sometimes I don't even get to ask my questions because we talk about yours instead. I am so glad that you're here, however or whenever you're with us. Today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Master Classes. Each month, we release a new skill in an advanced masterclass format designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or to get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, I'm going to introduce to you our guest today. No longer shall I make you wait. Her name is Susan McPherson. Let me tell you about her. She is a serial connector, a seasoned communicator, and the founder and CEO of McPherson Strategies, a communications consultancy focused on the intersection of brands and social impact. She is the author of The Lost Art of Connecting, the Gather, Ask, and Do method for building meaningful relationships. Susan has over 25 years of experience in marketing, public relations, and sustainability communications, speaking regularly at industry conferences, probably virtually right now, and is contributing to the Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Forbes. She has appeared on NPR, CNN, the USA Today, the New Yorker, New York Magazine, and the LA Times. She resides in Brooklyn, and right now she is my guest live. Susan, welcome.
I am so excited to be here, Kevin, and I want to bottle your energy and your effervescence. It's truly magical. Thank you.
Oh, there you go. Thank you. I don't know if it's bottleable or if anyone would buy it, but I suppose if they would, I'd probably try. You say it in the book, and it's the first part of the bio that you sent me that I edited a little, and it says you are a serial connector. So what does that mean, and how did you become that?
Well, interestingly enough, I am the prodigy or child of two serial connectors who had the ability to connect people across the miles using both their manual typewriters and a rotary telephone. And that was my formative years. Basically, every morning at the breakfast table, I would literally vie for real estate because they would have the 5 local newspapers spread out, plus yesterday's New York Times and yesterday's Boston Globe, because it would take, a day or two to get to upstate New York where I grew up. And they would be clipping and cutting, essentially, and then going to their manual typewriters and putting little missives out into the world saying, thinking of you, Cousin Harry, thinking of you, Reporter John. My mother did PR for public television. Or in my father's case, he was a professor for 40 years at a women's college. And he would stay in touch with not only students, but their daughters, who he would then have, and then their granddaughters, all through the U.S. mail. So I just assumed this is what everyone did.
But you were incorrect.
But in my 20s and 30s and 40s, it was my pride and joy to make introductions, to watch the magic happen when you introduce people. And I'll just tell you, the serial connector and that moniker came from a retreat that I went with 8 dear friends on for a weekend. And our goal that weekend was to come up with our elevator speeches or be able to articulate our superpowers. And at the end of that weekend, I said, "Hi, I'm Susan McPherson. I'm a serial connector. but I almost peed in my pants because it sounded so ridiculous. But now, 16 years later, I wrote a book on it. So
yeah, and so let's talk about that. The lost art of connecting. Here it is, everybody. You can see I have Post-it notes, which means I've already got stuff that I love. I, your consultancy isn't really about this directly. You help with brands and sort of stuff. So what did you do to write the book?
Well, a couple of things. A lot of people who see the title assume it was a response to the pandemic, right? Because we've been so isolated. But actually, the book was conceived 4 years ago, and my thesis was we had lost the humanity in connecting. What had happened is we became slaves to the clicks and the likes and the followers that our technology allowed. And we, instead of actually meaningfully connecting and following through, it was literally just this kind of urgent need to continue to get that self-gratification. And quite frankly, I myself included, I thought there's something wrong here. We need to get back that humanity that my parents so dutifully did every day.
Well, and so you wrote this book, and then sort of like our book, The Long Distance Date, coming out in the middle of this thing. It came out at sort of this fortuitous time. I want to talk more about sort of your lessons and your advice sort of from the pandemic and back. But for those of you that are live, if you have questions, or you just want to say hello, or you just want to tell the serial connector where you're from, you can do anything. Like, I'll put her on the spot and say, who do you know lives in town? I don't know. But in all seriousness, I want to talk about the core of the book. I mean, you talked about sort of the heart of the book just now. But the core of the book is in the subtitle. It's the 3-part process. It's gather, ask, and do. And obviously you can't unpack it all for us, but tell people a little bit about the 3-step process, if you would.
Absolutely. And for anyone in the audience who's ever written a business book, and you know this, Kevin, you have to have a methodology, right? So I did some deep soul searching, putting together the initial kind of framework for the book, because 95% of the business from my firm over the last 8 years has been inbound. So that taught me that what I had been doing all these years actually was something. There was some forethought in all of it. So the gather phase, which is the first phase, the most important thing you need to do is assess what is meaningful, what is a meaningful relationship to you, meaning do some deep set thinking, because for every single person, it's different. 2, what are your hopes and dreams and goals over the next 4 years, 4 months, even 4 weeks? And who is it that you want to connect with or reconnect with that is going to help you meet those goals, but also how you can be helpful to them? And also within the gather phase, what are your superpowers that you can be helpful to others with? Because the underlying theme of the entire book literally turns networking on its head by leading with how can I be of help rather than what can I get. And lastly, within Gather is to do everything that you humanly possibly can, if that makes sense, to break that hermetically sealed bubble, to connect with people who aren't just like you, look like you, sound like you, same age as you, same race and culture as you. Because we know we need, for our own betterment, for our own society's betterment, and to help us in business, right? We need to understand people who are different from us. So that's the gather phase. The ask phase is learning to ask the meaningful questions of others.
Before you go on,
of course.
I'm going to stop you. I should have stopped you before you started on ask, because I wanted to make a comment.
Of course.
I actually was going to ask you to tell us that critical question in a minute, but I want to go back and underline it, because there are people that are listening, and I need you to hear that question. How can I be of help to you? So it's like everything having some bandwidth issues on my end or your end, Susan. You get me now?
I can't. Yeah, I'm having a lot of difficulties hearing you.
Okay. Well, that makes it hard for me to ask you questions.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. It's the internet fault.
Yeah, it's all garbled.
Here's what we're going to do. We're not going to continue. And so if you're watching me, not Susan, if you're watching me, give me a quick comment if you can hear me. Yeah, cutting in and out. Oh, they can hear Susan, but not me. See, how about that? So apparently Kevin is the problem. Can you hear me now?
You're good now.
Okay, well, we're going to continue, and we're going to let Marissa edit this out in the post related to the podcast. But I want to go back, and what I was saying was that now we're saying no, they can't. Hopefully it's getting better. It looks like maybe on my end it's better. So I want to underline that question. How can I help, or how can I be of help? And as I don't know that you heard me saying it or not, Susan, but in a whole bunch of ways, that question has shown up in my life in the last few days. And it was sort of the exclamation point was put on it as the core idea, really, in many ways, of this book. And so I want to thank you for that. And I want to make sure everyone heard that before we left Gather, as to really focus on that idea. And I love this question, that other question that you asked, which was, what does meaningful mean to you?
Yeah.
That is fabulous. I mean, that's a fabulous question. Yeah. So you told us about Gather. So let's talk about ask and do. Talk about ask.
Sure. And thank you so much for repeating. We've all, after 15 months of this kind of crazy vortex world we're living in, we've gotten used to technical difficulties and just ride them through, right? It doesn't ruin everything. The ask section is all about learning to ask the meaningful questions of others that gives you a sense of their hopes and dreams and desires and wants. And if you listen carefully, which I learned we are woefully bad at, myself included, but then we get to go to the favorite phase that I like to live in, and that is the do phase. And that's where you become trustworthy, reliable, helpful, all the things that you can be, because we are all able, no matter who we are, what role we have professionally, or what our likes and dislikes are, we all have the means to be helpful to others. So that is kind of the very 30,000 foot view of Gather, Ask, Do. And obviously we can dive in and discuss more, but as mentioned earlier, that underlying notion is leading with how we can be helpful. So when you think of traditional networking, notice I didn't name the book The Lost Art of Networking. I see a very a delineation between networking and connecting. And connecting, to me, has that word intentionality associated with it. It has that word meaningful associated with it. And of course, leading with how can we be supportive of others, not in giving up who we are and not in not helping ourselves. But I fervently believe if we help others, the help comes back.
It's interesting because that's, I think, if we go to when people first talked about networking. Are you losing me again? I'm afraid you are. When people first thought about networking, that's what they meant. That's just not what it's become. And that's exactly the problem. Right? That's the problem. So if you love that word, I don't think you're saying don't use the word. I think hearing you is critical, though, about what you mean when you're saying all of it, right?
Well, and I'm not anti-networking. I mean, we all have to do it, and we will have to do it. But there's ways to make networking more meaningful and help turn it into connecting.
And that relates to a phrase I think you made up. I mean, I never heard it until in the book. What do you mean by that?
Oh, well, many of us in life have experienced FOMO, fear of missing out. And I think I first learned it in high school when I would come back on a Monday and learn about all the parties I didn't get invited to. But professionally, we all know we need to be at various places, various venues, and sometimes we don't get those invitations, right? So years ago, when I was in a business development role in a territory that didn't know the company I was working for, I realized I needed to create JOMO, not the joy of missing out, but the joy of meeting others. And I started very small, inviting the 3 people I knew in the industry I was working in the respective territory, which was in Southern California, which I grew up in upstate New York. I mean, I was a fish out of water. But I started with 3 others, and literally 2 weeks later, asked everyone to bring 2 people. And within 6 months, we had about 120 people professionally. So that was a classic example of you don't have to do all the inviting, but it is a great way to deal with the fear of missing out. But don't look at it as the joy of missing out. Look at it as the joy of meeting others.
The joy of meeting others. Okay, I was going to ask this later, but I don't think I can wait any longer. Susan, what if I'm an introvert? Because some people are saying, yes, but Susan, but Susan, you don't know. I'm not like you. I'm an introvert. Like, what is your advice? I know you talk about it in the book, but what's your advice here? I think it's important.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And I have fantasies that in my next life, I will be an introvert just so I can experience it. But
you see those as positive things? I mean, I don't want to know that.
No, there's lots of positive. And actually, in part of the book, I talk about a few senior executives over my career that I have witnessed them being introverts and being very successful in how they connect.
Absolutely, 100%.
And I think, first of all, taking out that moving from networking to connecting, first of all, is more feasible because you're not looking at 1 to 100 or 1 to 50. You're looking at more 1 to 1, 1 to 2. And when I was previously discussing the whole JOMO model, I'm not expecting you to be the one inviting everyone, right? The power of asking others to connect. But I like to, before you have events, whether they're online or in person, do a little bit of strategic reconnaissance. Find out, and we have many tools to do this nowadays. We can find out who's going to be in the room beforehand. So do a little kind of pre-event research to find out who intentionally do you want to meet. And go with what I call the event triumvirate, where you literally meet 3 people, learn 3 things, and share 3 things, meaning open up a little bit, but also learn, listen, and meet. Then you can go hide in the bathroom. But to me, that is feasible, manageable, doable. And if you're an introvert, you can actually do that. Another suggestion would be, if you can find out ahead of time who's going to be there, find the super connector in the room, okay? And then kind of draft off them the same way you would draft off somebody who is biking in front of you. But the most important thing is, if you lead with asking people questions about them, then you can just sit back and listen. So you don't have to do all the talking like I'm doing right now. So I'm going to.
And that's exactly right, because and so actually, in my experience, and it's like you, Susan, it's not me, but in my experience, those who are more introverted are actually better in some ways in this regard, because they don't feel like they have to keep talking, because they don't want to, where people like you and I might just keep on carrying on. So you said something interesting in the book, and I didn't mark it. I can't pull to it exactly, but you made a point that I think is useful. And I want to say it for everybody, not just for the introverts. And the point is, we've all had to go into this meeting, go into this session in this conference, go into this networking event, whatever, and been freaked out or scared or whatever. And we think we're the only one. And it's most everybody. And just that one thing, knowing that, and then saying it's not 100, it's finding 3. Yeah. Right. It's starting with one person. I think changes the whole dynamic for us.
And also I have found, and believe me, I get nervous too, and I want to hide in the bathroom sometimes. But when you see somebody standing or sitting by themselves, chances are, if you walk up and introduce yourself, that person's gonna, and I mean, this is a generalization, not every person, but that person most likely will breathe a sigh of relief, because that person won't be alone anymore. So for you to be afraid to go up and talk to somebody, I would suggest that is the time to do that. It's a humane thing to do. It's kind, it's compassionate. And quite frankly, we need more of that in this world.
I would agree with that. So you talk about a couple of other tools that I think are really useful. I mean, I really love that we've talked about sort of the mindset and the perspective of all this, and you've given us some very practical things to consider here. But you also talk about something that you call the 5-minute ask. So we're in the ask phase. We're not just in gather. And so describe for us what you call the 5-minute ask.
Sure. Well, just a reminder, the overall section is about learning to ask others meaningful questions. But obviously, given the subject matter, it's also about how do we ask for help, right? And I'm, from a woman's perspective sometimes, and again, generalization, but we tend to not necessarily ask for what we want, what we deserve, what is rightfully ours for the taking, so to speak. So to me, if we can become better at asking for help, we will all be, better off. But I fervently believe that it should be, don't make the big ask, have little asks along the way, because then the person you are asking of has a vested interest in your success. And then it is a much more reciprocal thing because you can make an ask with an offer to help along the way. Right. And, for those in the audience, I wish I could see a show of hands, but, how many of us have connected with somebody on LinkedIn and within 2 hours, they respond by trying to sell us something, rather than taking that opportunity to say, great to meet you, congratulations on, something, because they can find out by looking at your feed or maybe looking at your Instagram or your Twitter feed. And then maybe offering up just a little bit of, I happen to know somebody on the board of, or I happen to have a friend who lives in your hometown, it's just something, because that will change the dynamic. And then, of course, they can sell you something. But I just think it's when I was coming of age professionally, Kevin, and you probably know this, when we needed to research people before we met them, we had the Yellow Pages and the Encyclopedia Britannica. And now you have everything at your disposal.
Yeah. Yes, you do. And so, Marina, I was chuckling when you said, I wish I could see a show of hands. You don't need to see a show of hands because it's everybody, right? And so, it's the whole thing of we really need to get to know people before we ask them out to get married, right? Hey, we don't need to go all the way there before we even have had any conversation, right? So I think that's really, really fantastic. And yet I wanted to talk about the 5-minute ask, but because at the end of this, if we're going to create meaningful business relationships, it's got to be reciprocal both directions, right? So I really wanted to have you talk about that a little bit more. You mentioned this earlier as well. You talked about what you call in the book the 444, although you just went right through it as you made it in a sentence. But can you unpack this for people just a little bit?
Sure. Well, you've heard me say a couple of times this intentionality and the importance to be intentional. I mean, there's 8 to 10 billion people on this planet. We don't need to connect with all of them. And it is this notion of, what are the goals and hopes and dreams that we have? And I said it earlier, over 4 years, over 4 months, even over 4 weeks, and then be very intentional. And I would go so far as say, this very strange time we're living in where we all have a shared vulnerability. Everyone has been affected by this horrific pandemic. Some obviously at a much more horrific level than others, but nevertheless, it is almost like a great equalizer. I'm certainly not complimenting it in any way, but that shared vulnerability gives us this kind of commonality among the uncommonality. So I would go so far as say it's a very good time to be thinking, I have a reset opportunity. When in life have I really had that, that kind of, few months to kind of what is it that I want to happen in the next couple of years? And I think we're seeing that. I think people are making, career changes, career decisions. But I think it's also a time to really think about who do we want to reconnect with? Who do we want to connect with? How do we want to expand our bubbles? I joke, but a fish can't see water unless it breaks out of its bowl. So
we can't see that, right? Exactly. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the pandemic, and you've taken us there. So let's just do that for a second. So what would you say? I mean, you've asked a bunch of great questions for us to consider, right?
Yeah.
That the pandemic sort of puts in front of us, and seeing it as not just a challenge, but as an opportunity, which I agree with 100%. But specifically as a connector, what can we learn having lived through this or coming out of it to be a better connector?
Yeah. Well, number one, coming out of it, first of all, I would suggest that everybody in the room give themselves grace, and there is no rush. Meaning, I feel, we all of a sudden were like, masks off. It's okay. Let's rush to get together. And for people who were introverted, I'm sure it was terrifying, because for even people like myself, it was kind of like, oh, wait a minute. And I think it's important to honor what we've been through. And for many of us could still be going through. So, but I also think never before have we realized how important our connections are, because for 15 months, most of us couldn't get together and see one another and see loved ones. So my hope is going forward, even though we have short-term memories, my hope is when we are back in some semblance of normalcy, whatever that normalcy is. I would imagine it's going to be an normalcy. But I think, like, I'm hoping we don't stand there when we're talking to people looking at our email or looking over people's shoulders to find somebody more interesting or more connected, and rather really just listen and learn from one another, no matter what position each of us holds in society. And I know I sound very Pollyanna-ish, and I definitely am an optimistic human, but I think, the lessons learned, I hope don't go away. The good news is the technology has enabled us to stay connected, but I just hope that it doesn't replace human connection.
Well, since you mentioned the yellow pages, this makes this safe. I've been telling people, like, imagine if this had happened when all we had was a fax machine.
Exactly.
And you can't imagine it as challenging and difficult and everything, whatever adjectives you want to use that this has been. Yeah. Imagine what it would have done to our world if all we had was a fax machine and telephone. I mean, seriously, it would have been
everything
degrees. It would have been, exponentially more impactful in so many ways than societally and individually as it has been, as it was. So let's just talk about that for a second. This isn't a book about social media, and yet, as we're doing this live, that's where it's live, right? It's on YouTube, it's on Facebook, it's on LinkedIn right now. And you did mention a little bit about what you might do if you reach out to connect with someone on LinkedIn. But do you have any other advice around connecting as it relates to social media?
Sure. Well, the beautiful thing is we have all these platforms, right? I'm not suggesting people get on all of them, but find a couple that they're comfortable with. But be intentional when you are reaching out to people on these various platforms. The other thing I have found very helpful over the last few years when I meet people, either virtually or in person, is ask them what platform they prefer to communicate on. Is it text? Is it WhatsApp? Is it email? Is it phone? Is it a DM on Twitter or LinkedIn? And then make a note of that in your, whatever device you use. Because to me, if the holy grail is getting a response and continuing the conversation, well, then make it easy for the other person, right? And then, I'm not suggesting if they're on a platform you're not, that you completely have to, majorly, change your life.
Well, please, I was going to say, can I limit the number of choices I give them? Because, but I think your point is a really good one. I say that to leaders about the team all the time. Like, there's always a best tool for a given communication situation, and yet I'm going to lean into the preferences of my team members if it doesn't matter, right? And I hadn't really thought about it in terms of, outside of my team, but I think it's a really, really great point. It's a great point.
If somebody told you they were a vegan, you wouldn't suggest you go have dinner at, Ruth Chris Steakhouse, right? It's like, yeah. And again, if the ultimate goal is to continue the reciprocity, to continue the conversation, or you have an ask, you want to do what you can to make it as simple and easy for the other person. And somebody once went, let me back up. optimum is in person. I mean, I will just say that. And obviously we have had challenges over the last 15 months doing so. But I do believe in person for very deep or difficult conversations is the way to go. If that isn't possible, pick up the damn phone. Because in the research I learned for the book, I can't tell you how many times we misinterpret electronic communications. And sometimes the best way to clarify and to put everyone at ease is just pick up the phone if you can't actually have the conversation in real life.
We could drop the mic right there, except my mic is on the desk, so I can't. That would be enough. Is there anything, Susan, that you wished I would have asked, or that you think I should have asked, or that you just want to mention before we start to move into sort of the home stretch here?
Sure. Well, I think sometimes people are like, well, why does connecting matter? And I have to tell you, again, in the research I learned, a connected workforce is a more productive workforce. So if you run a company or run a business or run a nonprofit, it is to your advantage to make space for your employees to connect more than at the annual sales conference or the monthly Zoom happy hour. Okay, so actually make it part of the professional development, because your company will succeed in financially and reap the rewards of happy employees. Second, from a health perspective, and again, barring other issues we may have hand, but if we make connecting a meaningful part of our lives, we, again, all things being equal, will live longer in even greater spades than if we ate kale every day and ran every day. So to me, if you needed an incentive to want to be a better connector, to me, that's a really good thing to think about.
Strong social network adds 15 years to our life, everything else being equal. That's better than kale, better than stopping smoking. So there you go. So Susan, I know part of this answer. But no one else does. I mean, no one else that's with us right now knows. What do you do for fun?
Well, I have a remarkable dog named Phoebe, who is now back at my side. She just had ACL surgery in May, and she was in upstate New York, about 3 hours north. So she came home. So lots of just playtime with her. One thing, I'm a huge traveler, and this past 15 months, obviously, that has been put on hold. But in January of 2020, I went to Antarctica. And I honestly can't wait to go back. So that gives you a little bit of my wanderlust. I love that. So hopefully in another year, I can get back on the road and go to some pretty wild and amazing places.
I do not know if we've had a guest. I've never had a guest tell me that they've been to Antarctica. So there's one of the firsts.
I love that.
You've got, Susan, here. So a question. The only thing I told you I was going to ask you, what are you reading these days? Anything you want to share?
I'm just about to finish a beautiful book called Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. It will bring tears and joy and everything to your heart and your mind. Highly, highly recommended.
Somebody's Daughter. And I'm going to recommend that you all get a copy of The Lost Art of Connecting by the lovely and talented Susan McPherson. I want to just say three things about the book. There are three words in the title that are the three things that that set this book apart and that tell you, along with listening to this, what you need to know about this book. The word art, the word connecting, and the word meaningful. So those are the three words to me that matter the most in relationship to this book. You ought to get a copy. Where can they learn more about your work? Where can they get a copy of this book?
Well, you can get a copy at any of your favorite bookstores or anywhere online. And the website for the book is thelostartofconnecting.com. My company, which is a social impact communications firm, is McPherson Strategies. So it's mcpstrategies.com. And you can find me on all the interwebs at Susan McP1. And by all means, I'm open. I love feedback, suggestions, recommendations, and ideas of how you all connect, especially in this kind of rather unusual times we're living in.
All right, Susan, thank you for being. We're not quite done. I've got a question now for everybody else. No more questions for you, Susan, but now the question for everyone else, whether you're live or whether you're listening later, is now what? What actions are you going to take? Do you have a new strategy for the next time you're in a physical space with a bunch of other humans in that it's often called networking? Do you have a new strategy for thinking about what you might do differently on social media? Do you have a new appreciation for the importance of connections for you in your work and in your life? Those are just a couple of the things that I wrote down. Or are you just going to go out and ask yourself and ask others, how can I be of help? Whatever it is, if you don't take some action from this, what was the point? I mean, we're enjoyable to listen to, of course, but the reality is none of this matters unless you go take action. I hope that you'll do that. Susan, thanks again so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Kevin, it was such a joy. Really, truly, thank you. And thank you for having me as a guest.
It was a pleasure. We worked on doing this. We had to delay it. I'm glad we didn't have to delay any longer. So everybody, I hope that you found this of value. If you did, tell somebody else to join us. And if you did, I'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.